Hello and welcome back to the Out of Program podcast. So today we're joined by Dr. Ruby Wang, a doctor and the former head of health for China in the Foreign Office. She is director of Lintris, an award-winning consultancy that bridges China and the West on health policy, biopharma and MedTech. She is also on the Digital Health Council at the Royal Society of Medicine and writes the China Health Pulse newsletter. Hi Ruby and welcome to the show.
Hi, Jing. So great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with your early career. What drew you to medicine and what were those first years like for you?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a classic medical school application question. I think similar to a lot of other clinicians, combination of, family illness when I was young. I remember my grandmother had quite intense cancer journey, but ended up being like a miraculous turnaround by a life-saving oncology medicine called Gleevec. Really opened my eyes when I was about 11 to what medicine could do for families, for people you care about. And then also I had this fascination with surgery in particular. So since when I was young, the idea of using my hands to be creative and, make a difference seemed just very cool. So I think from a very young age, I'm actually against what my parents wanted me to do. They wanted me to go into the arts and the humanities. So very unusual for an Asian family.
Yeah, I mean, hold the press there. That is really unusual. I mean, most of the guests say the exact opposite. Where did that come from?
I think they're both in the humanities. They don't have science backgrounds, so they didn't really think about it as an important option. But I think for me, the surgery and the care taking and the making a difference, all of those factors combined, and I was pretty certain that I wanted to become a surgeon specifically. So, I was born in China, but I grew up in the UK. So even since when I was 12, 13, the GCSEs I selected when I was 14, and then my A-levels, all pretty, regular track towards applying to med school, got my volunteering bits in, worked in a care home during sixth form at the weekends, got my extracurriculars in. I was very into kind of violin and orchestra. So, Yeah, pretty classic medical school journey, I would say.
Wow. So you basically ticked all the boxes. Yeah, you seem like an absolutely model candidate and you knew what you wanted to do from a young age, which is quite incredible.
But it's interesting, right? Because when you get into medical school, then I think the real journey actually begins. I think a lot of teenagers, students, when they're applying to med school, that seems like the ultimate goal and it's so competitive. But when you've reached it and when you start in first year of medicine, it's never as you expect it to be. And it was an interesting journey, I think.
Was that the case for you?
Yeah, definitely. Med school was very competitive, a lot of studying, a lot of hard work. I did enjoy it, but it wasn't easy for sure. And I think as you go through the process, because it's so long, I mean, I had 5 years plus an intercalated year, and you think about the journey beyond that, your whole career of being a junior doctor, then a registrar, then a consultant. I think you then finally, as you start growing up, thinking about, is that what I want to do for my entire life? Do I have alternative options that I want to also pursue? So I think those thoughts started coming into my head as I went through undergrad med school, and then as I went to clinical placements in my last 3 years, and then also when I started practicing as well.
Was it a dramatic change going from medical school to practicing medicine?
Yeah, definitely. I think you would definitely say the same too, right? It's so different. Being a student and you're shadowing, you're maybe suggesting diagnoses when you're prompted by the doctors, but that true responsibility, I mean, it's incomparable really. And the hours of being a foundation first year and a second year, it's just so intense. I mean, in my first year, I think more than half the year I lived on hospital accommodation because I was in a district hospital in Oxfordshire, and it was just easier to be on site so that you could just, for a night shift, roll out of bed and walk 5 minutes into the ward rather than try to drive and risk, being too tired for the drive and dangers and things like that. So it was pretty full on. It's just your entire life in those first 2 years, especially.
And you mentioned that reflection about whether or not this was the thing that you wanted to do up until, registrar consultancy. How did your ambitions change when you started practicing? Because you mentioned that from a young age, you wanted to be a surgeon. How did that land when you actually started
Yeah.
practicing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are several factors, like both push and pull. I would say, the reality of working in the NHS, and, when I did my what we now call resident doctor, years 1 and 2, straight out of medical school, it was in 2016 to 2018. So it was under Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt. It was a very tumultuous time in terms of doctors' wages, welfare, lack of support. So I joined the Doctors' Union, the British Medical Association, and, there were a lot of strikes up and down the country. It was really a whole movement. And I felt really passionate about how difficult it was, this working environment that we were all in, the burnout, the pressure. So I joined the BMA, and I ended up becoming the elected regional representative for the whole of Thames Valley, which covers Oxford and the surrounding bucks. And I would attend the national BMA conferences, campaign and lobby, and think about what we could do to improve living circumstances, salaries, and welfare of doctors. At the time, I think even on night shifts in the doctor's mess where we're meant to rest between shifts, there were no beds, these crummy sofas we just try to curl up on to get 30 minutes
I
break.
remember them well.
You know them well, right? And even to get access to the doctor's mess, we had to pay. So, it's true. And, if we had to do exams, which were necessary for our jobs, we also had to pay thousands. And it was just it's still really awful. 10 years on, the situation is no different, especially with inflation. So there are still strikes now. But at that time, I think it was the first strikes doctors had done in 40 years in the UK. So it was really awful. And I think that whole situation made me realize, number one, if this is what my working environment is going to be, no matter how much I love the technical parts of the job, the operations and the very interesting learning of techniques and medicine, the reality of the working environment, they weren't sustainable for me. And then secondly, I think having those opportunities to go to those BMA national conferences and look at the health sector from a different angle, which was not clinical, but more about health leadership and health policy. I'd never, this too, like when you go into medical school, it's so technical. You don't realize this, but you don't learn about health policy. It's only clinical. So that was like also very eye-opening, showing me that just because I was interested in health and making a difference for patients doesn't mean you only can do that through being a doctor. There are other ways. And then I think the final pull factor for me out of purely clinical was, I remember in my second year, so F2, even the NHS back then, there was like whispers of health technology. Like our hospital, I was in Milton Keynes for a while, Milton Keynes NHS Trust, and they transitioned to electronic medical records. And it was the most painful process. We had like technicians on night shifts trying to tell us how to push buttons on these computers. But after the process had been accomplished, after like a whole month of painful transition, the impact was incredible, like on my working day. We had these Da Vinci robotic surgery had just come in. We went to check it out. It was just so cool. And again, I thought, I'm not a computer science person. I'm a doctor, but I can predict how much this is going to impact the future of doctors. And I wanted to learn more about it. So I think because of all of those things, I knew for a fact that, I wanted to take a break, a year out at least after F2, which is always, the natural break for doctors, but it made me like pretty certain I wanted to try something out. Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned Jeremy Hunt and the junior doctor strikes, because as I'm listening to you, I'm reflecting on my own journey. So I was also a house officer during that period as well, and I took part in those strikes. And I do wonder, actually, this generation of doctors that may have become disillusioned by medicine.
Yeah.
The first wave may have emerged from that period back in 2017, 2018, was it? And then, of course, there was probably a subsequent wave when, after the pandemic, when everyone felt incredibly burnt out
Mhm.
by going above and beyond. Um, so, yeah, it's interesting you say that, because certainly for myself, I think that the junior doctor strikes and a conversation that started around doctors' pay and their working conditions was probably one of the push factors for me as well. Although,
Right.
it had to be coupled with a pull factor. And for me, that
Yeah.
was founding Patchwork. So it's
Yeah.
really interesting what you described there.
Yeah, I think you're so right. Must have stimulated a wave of everyone wanting to seek out different things, or just, I think, opens your eyes to something beyond just clinical practice.
Yeah. And I think in the case of yourself, it sounds like your exposure to health technologies like the EPR rollout, like the Da Vinci robots, and I
Mm.
guess your involvement in the BMA got
Yeah.
you thinking differently and started widening your perspective. I want to move on now to a pivotal moment in your career, which was when you applied for the Schwarzman
Yeah.
Scholarship. So
Yeah.
this is not something I'm very familiar with. So could
Yeah.
you describe that for the audience?
Yeah, sure. So I guess you could view it as a sort of MBA program. It's an American scholarship. It's quite specific and it's based in China at Tsinghua University. I came across it by chance, actually. I think maybe via a newsletter or something like that. They were a relatively new program at the time, but quite prestigious. It's comprehensive teaching, networking, community, bringing, really great professors and mentors from around the world, especially the US and UK. And you go to China for a whole year with a small cohort, maybe 130, 40 people, and it's quite intensive learning. People from all different backgrounds. And, I just mentioned I knew I wanted a year out, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. But I wanted to learn and be mentored and explore. So I thought this was the perfect opportunity. Other options were, to go traveling and take some rest. But I thought this would be really fun for me because I think one thing I know about myself is that I really love learning. So it just fit, but it was quite a stressful application process. So I was so excited to be admitted. And it was, one whole school year. So it fit in really well with the F3 break. Um, and, it was life-changing for sure. Being around people who were ambitious, globally minded, very different from me. I was the first practicing doctor to ever enter that program. So everyone else, similar to an MBA cohort anywhere in London or Cambridge or the US, people from tech backgrounds, consulting backgrounds, policy backgrounds. So it was not only learning from my classmates, but also from the professors, and such great mentorship. I think across that year, though, as the months went on, I was getting very nervous about what I had to do when I left. Do I go back and apply for core training? It would have been obviously core surgical training, or do I take a longer break? Do I apply for a job? I'd never applied for a job then. When you go from med student to doctor, you have a process of application, but it's not like you interview properly and have a personal statement. It's a very different process. So I remember at the time I was asking any senior health person I could find that had left practicing to say, did you regret leaving practicing? What do you think I should do? And obviously everyone's answer was always, well, I don't know what you should do. You decide yourself. We think differently, but I can advise you and mentor you along the way. But ultimately, it has to be your decision. But I think for any doctor who's dedicated 5-10 years of their young life already to medicine and it's all it's terrifying to think about leaving. What do you have to fall back on? And I think we'll probably talk about this a bit later, but there's so much we can fall back on, in retrospect. So now it was such a great platform for me to jump off, having that support and mentorship, which I really needed. And, because it was a master's program, I had to write a thesis. So I chose to write it on health AI, like upskilled myself on health tech, which I really wanted to do. So everything kind of aligned. And it was really an amazing way for me to branch off into something different. But I know that, having talked to others, and including yourself, Jing, like a lot of people don't need that support, and they are confident enough to leap on their own straight from clinical practice. So I think everyone does it differently. There's no one way to leave medicine. Yeah.
I mean, that's a very kind assessment for what I did. I think, personally, I was just very foolishly optimistic. But so, I don't know how confidence played a part in that. But can I take it back a step? Because you spotted this opportunity and you went for it. But what made you think this was for you? The reason I ask this is because there are many things that you could have done in your year out. If you wanted to study an MBA, there are some globally prestigious programs in the UK.
Yeah.
To take the Schwarzman Scholarship, which, it seemed like it was a very relatively new program, and also it was all the way in China. Can you walk me through how you thought about this? Because it seems like a big risk.
Yeah, I guess you could think. Oh, yeah, I never thought about it that way. The other reason why it fit was because I'm ethnically Chinese. I was born in China, but I grew up here in the UK. So it was also personal reasons. I wanted to go back to my roots and spend some time as an adult in mainland China to learn about what it was like, get my Mandarin language skills better, live in the country that I would only occasionally visit to see family members. So that was also an exciting personal reason. And again, in 2018, China was on its way up. So we were reading more and more about it in the news, not necessarily in a positive way, but I recognized it was a shift in the way, the world was going. And I wanted to be there to see the changes. It felt very exciting. So I think also that reason was important.
So there were career, but also personal reasons for choosing this program.
I think that's always important, like any step that is a career decision is always actually also a personal decision. It's always joined, even if you don't think it is.
I'm going to reflect on that a little bit. So you complete the Schwarzman Scholarship, and you mentioned before that you were debating what you do next. Do you return to the UK to do core training? Do you, dare I say, apply for a job unheard of for clinical trainees? Right. How did you make a decision, and what happened next?
I mean, the reality is it was a really tough decision. A lot of uncertainty, confusion, asking questions, questioning myself. I think from the outside and also looking back, anyone's career path always, you can make it make sense and it looks nice and neat, right? But the process, as you know, it's always so much hesitancy and uncertainty. But, there comes to a point where you do have to make a decision. And I think bits of that year helped me decide. So, I told you I wrote my dissertation or thesis for the Masters on Health Tech. I was really interested in it. I actually worked during that year for a while at one of China's biggest tech companies called Alibaba. People probably know it now. So they had a health company called Ali Health. So it was a really cool opportunity to be in such a big firm but work on the health side. And then I think when I left, I had several options on the table and I considered them all. I talked to health venture capital firms, thought about working in health VC. I talked to people working at McKinsey. I thought about even applying through that specific routine process. I talked to lots of startups. I was asking them, what does strategy mean in a health tech company? What operations? That sounds really confusing. All of these bits. And then I had like an exploratory phase, which I often forget about today. Your brain just smooths over the kinks, I think. But I actually moved to San Francisco for a month or two, and I just lived there, hanging out with a lot of my classmates who were American from this work. So they were all back in, the tech hub of the world, because I thought if I want to work in health tech, I want to be somewhere where it's really happening. So I would, live in SF and take the train down to Palo Alto and check out these accelerators. I think YC and some of the other ones really hot at the time, and just go to these pitches and really listen and learn and ponder and be unemployed for a while. and then this opportunity for the British government came up, and it was really by chance. I can't remember, but I think it was someone I was catching up with, and then they mentioned that this job opening was available. And obviously I'd never worked in government, never really worked on policy, kind of studied it a bit during my MBA year. And I just went for it. And that's not very helpful to anyone listening, thinking about careers. But I think this happens all the time. These fluke instances or strokes of luck, or coincidentally something pops up, and it just seems so perfect on paper. They were looking for someone with a clinical background who knew the UK and China and wanted to work on technical collaborations between the two countries. I mean, it seemed like that's who I was as a person, and also what I brought in my professional background. But again, that was also a very stressful application process, because the UK civil service is very particular. So that was I didn't tell them at the time, but apart from applying to my MBA, that was my first ever job interview. So I was, you can imagine, very anxious about prepping and how to answer questions about, like, tell us about a time when you showcase leadership, all of these types of things. Yeah, I got the job. And so that's how it happened.
And I would love to explore that part of your life where you were part of the Foreign Office. But before I do that, actually, as you described everything, it made me think about, part of my own journey. So, and you might see some parallels. So when I was starting out, I also went on a fellowship. I went on the Peter G. Milner Fellowship. And I ended up taking a year out between my F1 and F2 because this opportunity came out of nowhere. So Peter Milner was a graduate of the University of Liverpool, and he periodically sponsors a fellowship to basically take a medical student or a doctor out from Liverpool to California to be exposed to biotech and biopharma.
Wow.
So this was the first year that he'd run it, and I was the first applicant. Yeah, so
Wow.
and like I said, I was only a foundation year 1 doctor at the time, but the opportunity couldn't wait, so I had to take it. And I also went to California and just kicked about for a couple of months. The work that he was doing was so advanced. The people working on it were people with PhD, MBA, MDs. They had triple degrees. And I was just a guy who'd just done 1 year of clinical practice. So I really didn't have much to offer. And I ended up staying in what they called a hacker dorm, which is,
oh my gosh,
because Californian rent and accommodation is so expensive. What happens is that there are people who just organize these houses where you just have loads of bunk beds. So you end up bunking with 4 to 6 people in a room, or people who have moved out to California to seek their fortune, either participating in Y Combinator or going on 500 startups or starting their first big tech job. So whilst I didn't learn a huge deal about biopharma, I did learn a lot about startups and being exposed to these individuals. And it was actually during that period where the idea for Patchwork came about, because I needed to go back and locum. So I don't know if there's any kind of parallels that people can draw from my experience and yours, but I guess there were just opportunities that landed, and sometimes you got to take them, and who knows where they lead.
I think, that's a very cool story. There's something about making decisions for yourself based on what's the right time and what you might not be able to come across later. But then also, once you expose yourself to, new spaces, you can't predict how that might inspire you to do something else, right? I mean, from what you shared and from what I know about your work, it's very clear how that was fundamental to then what you did next for Patchwork. So Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
It's serendipity, but you also engineer your serendipity based on, I guess, the mindset. Because just like you saw this opportunity and you simply took it. Others may have thought, oh, it's too far, it's too different,
Yeah,
it's too new. Whereas, being the first at something probably
yeah.
lessens the odds and allows you to shape things.
I think it's so interesting too because for us back in the day, not that we're elderly, but you know what I mean? Like back in
Yeah.
those days, there were so much less opportunities for British doctors to step outside of clinical practice. Whereas today we have, podcasts like this platform where you hear so much from others how to do it. There are doctorpreneur mentorship programs. I like help MedTech societies for med students in different unis in London. So there's all these ways to learn from others. But back in those times when we were trying to do it, it was really tough. We were really, you had to be brave.
Yeah, yeah. But like we said, being first helps because now there's so much competition for roles and opportunities. When we were
Mm,
doing it, there was probably, I mean, there definitely was just far less.
that's true. That's also true. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about your time then in the Foreign Office.
Mm.
How did you find it?
Yeah, it was such a great experience. So my job started about 9 months later than it was meant to because the COVID pandemic happened. And so I couldn't actually go to China. I actually went back to the hospitals here. It was opt-in. So they brought
Mm,
back retired doctors, medical students, people like me who had left, full-time practice. And I ended up working in London hospitals for about 6 months on the COVID front lines, which was, as you know, like very stressful and intense, but definitely worthwhile. I'm very glad I did it. I think a lot of doctors, you just want to be helpful in those times with the skills you have. And I definitely felt like I was able to do that. But all that while I was doing that quite intense frontline work, in the back of my mind, I was still thinking, when am I going to be able to go to China to do this job that is my dream job that I've worked really
mm,
hard for? And finally, middle of 2020 in the summer, there was a dip in COVID. They restarted the visas, and then I got my visa to go back to China. It was a really cool opportunity, but also I think sometimes in different career steps, you have to be realistic about the sacrifices you make. And, that was a big risk I took because to go to China when it was pandemic era with like one suitcase, like waving goodbye
mm.
to everyone I knew in the UK, not knowing when I'd be able to come back, it was, a big moment, but I knew that is what I wanted to do because to be able to work in that role, and the job description changed completely because I signed on to do collaborations across countries, and obviously the pandemic was impacting all health work between governments and ministries. So the job had changed completely, but I wanted it even more than before to be like in the eye of the storm, where the world's attention was on China and what it was doing on health. I just thought I couldn't turn down this opportunity, so I just went, and it was really, really interesting, to be in those rooms, listening to leaders, learning from them, diplomats, how to work in this space I'd never worked in before. I learned actually a lot more about health, yes, but also diplomacy as a whole, like policy making, how governments interact. It was a steep learning curve. Um, but it was really worthwhile, really, really cool opportunities. And I think even despite the difficulties at that time, the pandemic limiting, as I said, all this health work that I wanted to do, I'm still like really proud of what we managed to deliver there. And I think it was a lot of personal growth too, because it was a chance to work with, Chinese colleagues, professionally use my personal cultural background and my language across English and Chinese, and my clinical back. I was the only doctor there. Everyone else was staff or, program managers or diplomats. So to be able to bring everything I'd like built in my life to that role, it felt very important. And so it was very fulfilling, but obviously it was very stressful and
Mm.
intense in a way where sometimes I thought, wow, I really left the NHS to stop being so stressed, but here I am even more stressed. But it was definitely worth it and expanded, as we just said, like a new space where I expanded my horizons to what I thought was possible. I not only worked on UK-China health, but also got to know the other embassies, the US embassy, the other EU, Australian embassies, talk with them about health, not just technical health system strengthening and health policy, but global health and development, and became increasingly interested in the multilateral space, the UN agencies, World Bank, the foundations like Gates. And then that became another opportunity when I got to second to the UN in China and be a health advisor there for a few months. And then from then I became more interested in China and the global south, what's happening in the African continent, what you can do when there's not much resource. So like every step taught me something new. And today I'm so interested in all of these topics, and I would not have been exposed to them had I not had those steps. So all worthwhile and all very easy for me to relay to you as if it was smooth sailing retrospectively, but every step definitely questioning and uncertainty often. And certainly for that role too, when I decided to come back to London, I felt it was because I'd learned what I could learn in that role. And what I wanted to do, that role couldn't provide me because of the limitations, politics. Like you couldn't do health work to a certain extent because in 2022, it was still very COVID heavy.
So you opted to come back to the UK. Did you have anything in mind on return, or was it very open-ended?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I've come to realize is that I'm the type of person where if I make a major decision, I like to do it slowly and with a break in between. I mean, that's how I transitioned into that government role and how I transitioned into this role now. I think it's important to recognize what you're like as a person and recognize what's comfortable for you. I talk to friends all the time who need a job lined up before they can leave their
Yeah.
current role. But I realized I don't work like that very well. I need like a mental freedom
Mm.
to look inwards and then think slowly about what really matters to me and what really excites me about my career. And so after that Foreign Office role, which moved into the UN role, I came back to London and I just wanted to take a break. So I was just gonna chill out, settle back in, do some traveling. And then as I was doing that, there were some freelance projects that came in
Mm.
based on my networks that I had built. I kept in touch with mentors. And I think one of the really important things that my MBA program, the Schwarzman Scholarship, taught me was the importance of mentors.
Mm.
Often almost an American concept, this concept of mentorship. And maybe because that program was American, but to learn from people that you respect, from their own journeys, but also get their advice on when you're trying to make a decision. I think leaning on others for support is really important. I really appreciate that. So having that kind of interaction, keeping in touch with networks, a couple of freelance opportunities just came up for me to advise on, big pharma strategy in China or on health policy alignment or on health tech market access. So these small projects were just, coming up and I was just doing them in the background. And then it just came to a point where it made sense for me to build it all together as a company. And, in the UK, it's very easy to sign on and become a
I,
company.
I think that this experience that you describe will be of huge interest to the audience because essentially you'd spent your time building out your network, and suddenly when you returned to the UK, you
Mm.
converted all of that into a business. So I just want to zoom in a bit more on that. And if you can walk me through some of the thinking there, because you have your network, they're now approaching you based on your expertise and your experience to say, hey, can you do some work for us? How did you convert that into contracts? How did you make that into paid gigs?
Yeah, I'm laughing because you make it sound so nice. Like, I don't think I was intentional at all, honestly. I would post on LinkedIn, and I mentor students now about career changes out of medicine. I always tell them LinkedIn seems so cliche, but it's actually so useful. Any kind of platform where you can just say as well as do is essential. Whether that's you saying it directly to one person at a time when you're networking, or just posting on a social media platform about what you're up to professionally, it might seem awkward or embarrassing or, self-serving, but it is necessary to do that to go forward. So I'd been kind of posting haphazardly, not strategically on LinkedIn throughout my time in the previous jobs. And again, also with the mentors and friends that I've been keeping in touch with. And so these opportunities just, I guess, came up. And it came to a point where, I thought this makes sense for me to make what I'm doing now into more of a full-time thing. But still, honestly speaking, at that time, I wasn't sure it's what I wanted to do full-time or for a long time. It was just convenient and the best option at the time to fit in with how I wanted to live and be fulfilled generally. And, it just continued from there. I built a website. I had more contracts, and just also through that process was upskilling myself on how to be a consultant. I'm not McKinsey trained. My PowerPoint slides are not very beautiful at all. So having to train myself on how to communicate and present in a way that's professional and comparable for clients was new skills. But I love learning. So, learning about how to do these things was really fun as well.
How did you decide how much to charge?
I still don't know. That's a great question. I love how you just pitch that right out there. I just ask people I know. And, being very frank here, this is how consulting works. You charge different levels for different types of work and for different types of clients. Even now, a lot of my work is pro bono, as we can say, or for free. But in my mind, it's equally worthwhile as something that pays more because it fulfills a different part of what I'm trying to achieve. For example, if I'm working with an academic partner, or if I'm writing something for my newsletter, all of that is voluntary time, negative salary time. But in my mind, it fits because it's contributing towards my personal excitement to write more. It fits in with what I'm trying to build, which is myself and my company as a reliable, trusted source of insights. And so different types of partnerships or client, consultant relationships bring different things. And I think at the end of the day, it's just what I personally feel comfortable with, and leaning a lot on friends. I'll call a friend and be like, do you think that's okay? Or charge, that kind of thing. So having those conversations is really important. And certainly this is such a fuzzy space, right? What do you charge? I mean, recently, in the past couple of years, I've had different friends who've also left their respective careers, whether that's sales or climate, to start their own consultancies. I think it's the trendy thing to do now. They've come to me and said, how much do I charge? And I can give a certain level of my experiences, but because it's a different sector and a different client, then my suggestions might be completely off. So, yeah, I don't really have an answer for you there.
I think that's answer enough. You just have to
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yeah. Or you can DM and then we can talk privately about what yeah.
Yeah, you heard it here. Ruby's happy to give you all advice on this. So you start getting all this inbound, you start packaging it all up, and it becomes Lintris, which is your
Yeah.
consultancy. I suppose, what were some of the biggest challenges for you in launching it and growing it?
One of the main challenges is knowing what my strengths and weaknesses are. I think my strengths are that I'm quite technical and process driven. And so, I'm always approaching things with the way we were trained in medicine, essentially.
Mm.
And my skills in promotion and saying about what I'm doing are not as strong. So I think I'm always trying to improve that, but doing that from the beginning was tough, especially when I started, I was doing it on my own, recognizing how I'm perceived by potential clients and, building confidence and reputation as an independent client and then building a small team with that versus what I was used to, which was having a role, whether that's as a doctor in the NHS or working in government or the UN, with a, institutional platform backing. So I used to be the one that people came to, but now I had to be the one to approach. And I think that switch, it took some time. But I think going back to what we're talking about in terms of push and pull factors, is I love the flexibility of it. There's so much autonomy, and that is very scary. But I think throughout all of my career shifts thus far, I transitioned enough times that I'd built up the confidence in myself that I'd be able to know myself well, to know
Mm.
what I enjoy and what I'm fearful of and what I'm good at and what I'm less strong at. So I knew that in doing this, I would open up opportunities for myself in terms of the job flexibility, the ability to choose clients or projects. And then that opened up free time for me to do other things like dip into clinical practice, maybe once or twice a month, locuming,
Mm.
um, you know, working pro bono on academic research projects, doing volunteering work. So that ability to be more flexible and balance my work was really important to me because having worked in the NHS and in government, I knew what it meant to dedicate my work and personal life to my job. So I wanted this next phase of my career to be a lot more self-driven. And this way of doing it allowed me to do that.
It's fantastic to hear that you're still clinically active. How do you see that balance between your clinical work versus the business work, the consulting work?
So, I don't practice very often, and there's a limited window for this because, as we know, doctors in the UK, we have approvals every 5 years. So mine will run out later next year.
Mm.
And, I have to decide whether to refresh the approval and extend for another 5 years. I'll decide when that time comes. I don't practice often, but I make sure I do it. I think number one, because, it is what I was trained on since I was a student. So I do love it, being able to talk to patients, use my medical skills to diagnose, even to do something like take a blood test or, put in a cannula for a patient when the nurses aren't able to or to help them out. All of that just feels very cool because being a doctor is not like any other career in the world. You can't compare some of those things you do day to day that full-time doctors take for granted. But when
Mm.
we now spend a lot of our time in front of computers or in offices or in meetings, you really appreciate those practical opportunities and that human interaction so much more. So I really do savor those days where I get to go and practice. But I think also it streamlines really well because a lot of my work now as a consultant, it's about health technology and how to integrate that into existing systems in a way that benefits patients and doctors. So being able to work in that system and like come face to face with the struggles of the system really helps my health tech work. It also helps the health policy work too. So I think it all fits in very nicely, because if I was to consult, for example, on, a project that required thinking about doctors' challenges, if I'm not a doctor myself today, how can I authentically know what the best strategies are?
Mm.
So I think it all comes together very nicely, in a way that I never expected. Because, when I wanted to go back into hospitals, it was more because I just missed it. But now I can see how it all fits in together so well.
Yeah, it reminds me of when Anas and I were just starting patchwork,
Mm,
and he was much longer than I was, because I was completing my
mm,
foundation year 2 training. And what I found really interesting was that despite having some awful rotations at the time, A&E, and having these
gosh.
brutal night shifts and weekends,
Yeah.
I actually found it quite cathartic, because I was approaching medicine in a very different way. I was looking at the problems I was facing with
Yeah.
an eye to opportunity rather than with frustration.
Yes.
And then I
Totally.
could take that energy into the business, and they fed into each other really nicely. So I
Yeah.
totally understand that, but I think it's quite a counterintuitive concept for many when they think about, moonlighting as an entrepreneur whilst also, practicing full time. So
Yeah.
so I totally resonate with what you described there.
Yeah, totally. I think you said that really. Again, it's something about recognizing who you are as a person and what drives you, right? So I
Mm,
think we share this bit where it's about being able to think creatively about a problem so that you can be the one trying to solve it. Whereas if you're a doctor straining and struggling in the health system and having less agency, I think that would make me feel very frustrated. But then when you feel more empowered to be able to turn it into you trying to bring solutions in, it makes it so much more fulfilling and meaningful. And this might not be the case for everyone, but it's really great when you recognize that trait in yourself, because then you can channel it into something useful.
definitely. Well, we're running out of time, so last couple of questions.
Mm.
You've We always ask about the advice that you would give. Now, the thing I've heard throughout this episode is know yourself. But what
Yeah.
other, but I'm wondering, what other kind of advice would you give to
Yeah.
clinicians that are thinking about exploring non-clinical practice, having different kind of career paths? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say there's never been a better time to leave or to come back. You're never shutting yourself off from one opportunity when you take another, even if it feels like it at the time. There's always ways to make life work. I'm very optimistic in that, in that mindset. I think what we were saying about push and pull factors is so important. Um, I would never advise for anyone to make a decision to run away from something because they don't like it. You should
Mm,
always move towards something because you really love it and you're passionate about it. That's always the better way to go. Um, so if you're thinking about leaving medicine and the NHS in the UK or, elsewhere because you're burnt out and, tired and you're searching for something else, I would say think about what you would want to do instead as the pull and the driver for you to be seeking that new opportunity. And, we've said this already, but, everyone from the outside, especially somewhere like LinkedIn, it seems like it's all shiny and certain, but behind the scenes is just a bunch of humans and doctors who are very confused at various times. Um,
mm,
Definitely reach out, to Jing, to me, to anyone, because we're always keen to share our experiences and always learning from each other. Um, and, mentorship and networks is so important, to have a community to lean on rather than, try to suffer on your own. Because, even my career today, it continues to be non-linear. I can't predict to you what I'll be doing in 5 years' time. I might have expanded Lintris, my consultancy. I might be doing something else. I'm always thinking about what continues to make me excited to work. Before we started recording, Jing, I was sharing with you how at the moment I've been doing a lot more writing. So, starting on my China Health Pulse newsletter, that's been going for about 7-8 months now. That's been a huge driver. I've been so excited to do more public writing, pitching as op-eds too. I'm writing a book on China's health innovation. All of these are new challenges. I dropped English after GCSE. So, as a fully STEM, fully science person, it's a huge challenge, but I think that's what makes it exciting. So keeping going and not being certain certainly drives me. I know some people really like the idea of career stability and knowing what they'll be doing in 20-30 years' time. But I imagine anyone listening to this doesn't think like that and is on the lookout for something stimulating and exciting. So yeah, it's not about leaving medicine, but expanding your horizons.
Right. So, well, thank you for that, Ruby. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining me. And for all those listening, if you like what you hear and want to support the show, please do like and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever podcast platform you are currently listening to us. It would mean a lot to me, and it would help spread the message to others exploring alternative paths. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time. Bye-bye.